Welcome back to 42 to Doomsday. My name is Mark.
And I'm Rob.
And in this very special episode, we're joined by Aron Challinger from Aron's Collectables and Dr. Jason Bainbridge, the Dean of Humanities and Communications from the University of Southern Queensland. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us.
Now, let's just backtrack a bit because in episode 106 of 42 to Doomsday, we released the Unleash the Hoarders episode, where Aron detailed the amazing story of uncovering one of the largest collection of domestic home videotapes and other ephemera.
And in episode 110, we interviewed Dr. Jason Bainbridge, who took possession of the collection via Aron. Since we've been off the air, we've been receiving messages about what's happened with the tapes. So tonight we're joined by both gentlemen to discuss the latest developments and also answer what's next. As Mark said, welcome to both of you.
Thanks for having us on. I think the reaction to the episode I did has been quite amazing and hasn't showed much slowing down since we recorded it, and I'm still getting asked questions every day. And one of the reasons I think I said maybe we should do another episode was it all blew up on, I think, the Ian Levine forum last week with a whole lot of speculation and misinformation, and I was watching it thinking I don't really want to wade in. So maybe we'll do a more in-detail look of what's happened, and it'll just answer all those questions for everyone in one go.
So, Jason, thanks for your patience while we've gone through all that. So, since we last spoke with you and you went into an extended discussion about what you do and how all this this discovery fits into the coursework, can you just give us an update on where you're at and what work has been done to date?
Yeah, absolutely, Rob. So basically at the University of Canberra, we'd catalogued about a quarter of the collection, which might give you an idea of the scale of the collection. So in this period of time since we last spoke, that's what we've achieved at the University of Canberra. Now, also in that time, I've moved universities. I'm now at the University of Southern Queensland. So I'm happy to announce tonight that we will actually be working together, the two universities, University of Canberra and University of Southern Queensland, on the collection. We'll be moving the collection up to our campus in Toowoomba at the University of Southern Queensland, where we'll be embedding it in that coursework process that we talked about previously. We'll be getting students involved in this. We'll be getting staff. And most importantly, what we touched on at the end of our last sort of discussion is we'll be setting up a bit of a platform/channel through which we can disseminate some of our findings as we work through this, because we realise that there's a lot of interest, not only obviously in the potential of finding missing episodes, but also in some of the advertising, some of the bumpers, some of the other bits of material that appear as part of the tape collection. So one of the things we're looking to set up is this channel which will showcase our findings as we work through the collection.
To clarify on that, Jason, when you say a quarter of the collection's been catalogued, that's actually just logged into the system. None of the tapes have actually been looked at and catalogued as to what's on them, have they?
No, that's correct. So that's simply putting it into the university system. So I think, and you can speak to this as well, Aron, I think that should give the listeners some idea of the scale of the collection, that's been what's been happening in the background.
When I sent you up the collection, I estimated maybe there was 20,000 tapes. Do we know how many tapes there actually are?
No, we don't, because we've only worked through a quarter of them. And I mean, the other thing to be aware of is that, as again you'd be aware, Aron, the tapes are all of differing lengths. So there are some very long tapes that are part of this. We have not played any number of tapes yet, so we don't know the actual condition or playing condition of some of them. This has simply been putting them into the university's catalogue.
Jason, in recent days, if those of us who follow the Film is Fabulous Twitter feed will have seen them taking possession of at least one person's estate, 600 film prints, and sort of working with the university to have them catalogued, digitised, I suppose, and returned to the relevant copyright holders. Is that the sort of thing that you envisage with what you're going to do with this collaboration between the two universities?
Potentially, yes. I mean, certainly it depends on the material that we find. I mean, again, as we spoke last time, some of the videotape and other recording devices are marked, so we have an idea of what may be on them, if we can trust what's written on the side. But a very great number are completely blank. So it will be a case of discovery as we work through it. Certainly the intention is with advertising and short snippets for educational purposes, we'll be able to showcase those as we go. But very much so the intention would be to return some of that to the copyright holders where appropriate, yes.
And in terms of making some of this material publicly available, that'll be, I suppose, a collaboration between the two universities on a digital platform like something like YouTube, I would imagine?
Yes, I mean, most of that will be done through the University of Southern Queensland because this will become the physical home of the collection going forward. But certainly that is the intention, is that we'll have a YouTube channel. I mean, part of the delay in going through the material has also been to make sure that platform's set up, because the intention would be that we'd be releasing material onto that, if not every week, then certainly every second week. So there'll be a constant rollover of content, which again speaks to the volume of this collection.
And just reflecting on the last year of sort of working with material, has it really hit you about the size and the scope of the endeavour of the gentleman in question in terms of devoting a large portion of his daily life to recording Australian television output?
Very much so. I mean, it is very hard to get a sense of just how large this collection is, and very much the manpower that's gone into the recording. I mean, you know, we talk about the fact that so many of the tapes are blank, but even to have archived what he did, to have actually written on the side of the ones he did, was a mammoth undertaking. So, I mean, we owe this gentleman an enormous lot of gratitude for the work that he's put into preserving ephemera, which would have been completely lost otherwise. But certainly the scale of it continues to astonish me day by day.
In a sense, I suppose, in doing this work in terms of preserving Australia's television history, would you be on the lookout, perhaps not actively considering the size of this one, but would you be on the lookout for similar collections of similar vintage?
Yes, he says very cautiously. Yes, of course. I mean, I think one of the important things going through a collection like this can do, and I think particularly that's where educational institutions like the universities can play a part, is to raise public awareness and consciousness of this stuff that's out there. I mean, we've all heard sad stories of skips turning up to places and things being lost and dumped, etc., etc. And in fact, a great deal of our kind of cultural heritage when it comes to pop culture particularly is thanks to the diligence of fans and people that manage to save these things from being lost. So I think anything we can do to lift that public consciousness about the importance of preservation, about the possibility that stack of videotapes that has been part of your grandfather's collection for X number of years might hold something quite important. I think that's part of the important work that this collection does, is raising that public consciousness and awareness.
So, Jason, in terms of how you're going to tackle going through this collection, are you going to start with these VHS first, or the order, the way they've been catalogued? Have you worked out that process yet?
Part of it, I'll be completely honest, Mark, has been trial and error. So I think one of the things that the University of Canberra kind of experience has taught us is that we should be working in parallel while these things are being catalogued as part of the university collection. So certainly the intention is, once the collection is moved up to the University of Southern Queensland, it'll be a bit of a tandem process, that while it's entered into the university's collection there, we'll actually be starting to work on some of those beta tapes and some of the VHS. So the low-hanging fruit, in inverted commas, of material that's relatively easy to work through without the risk of damage particularly. So we can actually start to get some of this material out there. I think that's been something which has frustrated me a little bit with the kind of cataloguing processes, that we've kind of had to step back a bit while that's been done rather than getting into the tapes. So certainly that's a lesson learnt, and I would hope that we'd certainly be moving on, looking at what's in the collection and putting some of that up for public consumption just after the middle of the year, I think would be ideal.
Aron, I believe that you have been able to send some of the tapes that you were able to recover from the collection and have them professionally looked at.
Yeah, from the last time we had a talk about this, I can expand a lot on it. When I was talking about the tapes last time, I was talking generally, and I didn't want to get anyone's hopes up as to what was on them or how old they were, because anyone can write anything on a tape, but that doesn't mean that's actually on the tape. Most of the stuff went up to Canberra because it was just a mad rush to try and save the entire collection, get it out of the estate before it was destroyed. Luckily, after this happened, they didn't immediately destroy the estate. As far as I know, the house is still there with what I didn't take still in it, because it all got I guess, a bit caught up in legalities. After the stuff went to Canberra, I was still going to the house for many months and still finding incredible stuff because everything was just hidden all over the place. And I was able to send maybe a dozen reel-to-reel videotapes from the late 60s to mid-70s over to the UK to experts who were able to bake them and get playbacks off some of them. And I would say it's disappointing to see what was on them, as into what we could have lost if we'd got there a few weeks earlier. But it was also encouraging to see what was on them, because what was written on the tapes tended to be on the tapes, and it confirmed what the family had told me as to what the collection was and what it held.
Well, just off the top, Aaron, because we were discussing this afternoon, you mentioned that obviously a large portion of the collection itself, sort of before you got there, was destroyed. That material had been effectively shredded. It went into machines and was, just shredded and then dumped at a local tip here in northern Melbourne. That's correct? I only asked that just to completely put a line through the prospect of any of it being recovered.
Yeah, that's 100% correct. As soon as I realised what we were dealing with, I told a couple of people. They checked and I checked. Originally, they didn't want to tell us the disposal, the hard waste where it went to. But when we sort of were kicking up a fuss and saying, look, this is really important historical stuff that could be really, really valuable, they said, well, this is the process. It went to a recycling centre, which you think would be good, in Ferntree Gully, but it was such a big amount of stuff. They just put it from their larger trucks into other trucks, and it went to another recycling centre in Coburg. We contacted that centre, and they said within 15 minutes of it being there, giant magnets would have ripped out any of the metal that they were going to recycle, and everything went into those huge metal drum with spike crushers, and it would have all been destroyed 15 minutes after it got there.
And Jason, this goes to show, I suppose, estate planning for, if you've got a large collection of this sort of, material that is of historical value, not that we're, lawyers or anything like that, I suppose, but estate planning to determine what is going to happen to your collection of anything is important, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think, this is a story we hear so much when it comes to collectors of all sorts of material, but particularly audio-visual. I think we've had that, for a long time, that sense that VHS particularly is worthless, which is a terrible message to send out there, because it is relying on fans to, do these recordings of things that we would otherwise lose. So I think, the more that any collectors listening to this can sort of start to think about, it's a horrible thing to think about at times, but to start to think about some estate planning, I think, is very wise, because there is nothing more tragic than to think about what's lost. However wonderful the discoveries that lay ahead of us with this collection may be, it's always tainted by that knowledge that a great deal was lost. And as you say, a simple bit of estate planning, just letting people know your wishes, putting contact numbers through for, universities, people like Aron, etc., just to make people aware that, when the time comes, this is what needs to happen with this collection, or what should happen with this collection, I think really is important, because otherwise just so much.
And Aron, we'll get on to what you've discovered from sending the tapes to the UK in a moment. But you yourself have experienced almost a constant interaction with the community, people coming to you and saying that, they've got this, that, or the other in terms of, audio-visual material. And I think you've said that you've seen at least 2 estates with large VHS collections. Is that right?
The podcast, I think one of probably the biggest podcasts I've been involved with, because it broke beyond the Doctor Who community, which obviously you aim at, and it made it to the more general community. And I, a year out, still get at least one call a week from that podcast saying, I'm in an antique shop in Tasmania. I remembered the podcast. I've seen a bunch of old film cans. What should I do? Or people from Perth have called and said, my aunt's died. We've gone round to their place and they've got like 100 VHS. Should I be saving them? And I said, well, what's on them? And they're like, well, it's 90s Home and Away. And well, no, we probably
burn it all.
I think the thing with what Jason was saying about preparing for what happens if you have an estate, what I have found is the people who really look at that tend to be the ones that kind of know what's going to be valuable and what isn't, and will save it anyway. It's more the people like the estates I have seen that are probably hoarders to the point where they've excluded most of the people in their life, so they live alone. And by the time anyone finds out what they've got, estate trustees have gone into the house, destroyed all of that stuff, and are looking at processing the property. So it is a hard one to really deal with, but I do think the awareness within Australia was definitely put up because of that podcast. And I've had people come across to visit me from interstate just to talk about, what I was discussing in that. There's a Brian from Perth who's come across to the shop a couple of times, and because of that podcast, went back to the start of 42 to Doomsday and listened to every single one of the podcasts.
My condolences, Brian, if you're listening.
In terms of estate planning, it is a way of honouring your dedication to whatever it is that you really love. Otherwise, I mean, it's just gone. As Jason says, it is hard to contemplate your own demise. But if you put some thought to it and realise that all this work that you've been putting into collecting all this stuff can have a life beyond you, then planning for that honours what you've done and, shares that with the rest of the world long after you're gone. So credit to you, Aron, for taking on board all that communication. Are you happy to continue doing that? And if needs be, contacting people like Jason to see whether they're willing to take on important collections?
Absolutely. It's much better for anyone who's listening to contact me and me to say, no, it's really not going to be worth anything, than it is to just think, well, maybe it's worth something, but I won't say anything, and we lose something that's of historical value. Just a small story that you would know because you were involved when it happened. Another huge media collector passed away in Australia about 6 months ago. His name was Peter Tatchell, and his particular area of interest was comedy radio recordings and old comedy and things like that. And he had, on many occasions, the only existing copies of various BBC shows. And some of the BBC releases for the BBC audio have thank yous to him on their shows because he lent them the copies. When he passed away, I was contacted at least 3 times saying, this person has passed away. We're worried that his collection is going to go to the tip. Can you do anything about it to make sure that it's saved? And I'm just a secondhand dealer and I run a toy shop, but I've got a good network of friends, including you guys. And Dave Hoskins, who's been on the podcast a few times, was able to track down through the funeral home the family and make sure that material wasn't going to end up destroyed. So there are definitely people out there that are on game looking for this stuff and making sure if someone high profile like that passes away that it doesn't get junked.
All right, let's go back to what you said earlier about taking or sending some material to the UK. What was discovered on those tapes, if you can say anything?
Well, if I can go back a tiny bit and give some more background now that I couldn't before. The collector who, the hoarder, I guess, who passed away, his name was Noel Williams. And it wasn't him who started the collection. It was his father, William Williams. And he had started recording, as far as we can ascertain, in about 1969. I have found in the paperwork repair invoices or receipts for like 1970 on a reel-to-reel machine. So he was definitely recording before then. There wasn't a lot of stuff that early, just because it seems like he got his first machine 69, maybe for the moon landing. That's speculation, because big historic events like that often cause someone who's been doing audio to jump across to video. And Simon, who I was dealing with at the estate, told me William had primarily got the machine to record Noel's favourite programs. And Noel's favourite programs were Star Trek, Doctor Who, and later Countdown. And the earliest tapes that I have found that had Star Trek written on them, so this is pre-beta VHS, even pre-Umatic, so reel-to-reel. One was a Star Trek tape, and it went over, and it was indeed Star Trek that was recorded on it. It was baked. I think it was baked a couple of times because it was hard to get a playback. I've got a playback, a copy of that, and I think, if it had been an episode of Doctor Who, it would have been perfectly watchable. There's a few lines through it, kind of thing. So that's really positive, because it means what they were saying to me about what was recorded on the early tapes was actually there. I've looked at it, I've seen it. That tape has missing material on. It has about 30 missing adverts. I mean, that's not anything too stunning. There's some really funny ones and there's some historical ones that you kind of sort of go, well, that wouldn't fly now. So that's really positive that, yes, they said that they recorded Star Trek and Doctor Who from that period. It was a Star Trek tape and it was written Star Trek and it was an episode. It was from the mid-70s, so it wasn't one of the really earlier ones. What's more exciting is Simon told me William, who worked at a university in Victoria, couldn't really get tapes to record stuff at the time because obviously the machines cost as much as a car, and then there was nowhere selling tapes domestically to anyone. And a lot of the tapes that were recovered had university interviews on, and some of them had a log, like a library log, inside the tape of the condition of the tape. So it would be, tape was used on this date, the tape was used on this date, everything fine. And then it would say line has appeared. And it seems to be if a line appeared in the tape, it wasn't kept or reused by the university. So William was taking them home to use the tapes to record stuff for Noel. And I presume that would have been the earliest stuff because it was before U-matic and before VHS. So the tapes were coming from the uni. The interesting thing about some of the tapes from the uni is they had interviews which were part of university courses, and the university courses had dates on them. And as far as I know, the earliest domestic recording from the university or the interview was from 1969. So we're talking when all of Troughton was still screening on the ABC.
That's encouraging, but also knowing that a large portion of it is shredded in somewhere in a tip in Coburg, a little bit heartbreaking as well.
Well, the really heartbreaking thing is, as far as I've been told, and look, there hasn't been a lot looked at. It's just been the half a dozen 60s tapes or 70s tapes I found after everything was cleared out that I was able to get over to people in the UK that could look at this and assess it. As far as I've been told, the university interviews were recorded over. It didn't seem to be when he recorded anything off TV that he ever recorded over it. And that's why he had such a massive collection. He seems to be a one-time taper. And the Star Trek tape goes for about an hour. I think the tape's about an hour and 10 minutes. It starts with the credits of the show before, has the voiceover, Pete Smith, saying Star Trek's about to come in, the ad break, and then ads for different shows. And then it has Star Trek. All the ads and the intros and outros are left in. And then after Star Trek ends, it goes into the movie Peter Gunn, and that is left on till the end of the tape. So he didn't edit anything, which is great, especially for Australian content who are looking for things like the continuities and adverts. And it also means that he didn't record, like there's the example of the dentist in the UK that recorded the Ice Warriors, and then tapes were so expensive. His son watched them over the school holidays and then they were recorded over. It seemed like he was a hoarder, and he gave that sort of hoarding mentality to his son, and he recorded stuff once and then kept it for posterity.
And Jason, hearing that, I mean, that obviously presents you and your team and your students with the potential for a wealth of material to go through and catalogue, because if he's not editing as he goes, you're getting continuity announcements, you're getting advertisements, you're getting probably portions of news broadcasts that may not have been retained. In one sense, that's quite exciting, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, because, I mean, particularly for our students who are growing up more and more in a streaming age, I mean, it also highlights not just sort of the cultural history that is presented in those advertisements, as Aron said, some of the material that certainly wouldn't go to air today. So it's introducing them to, ideas of stereotyping and equally how advertising has changed over time. It's also giving you an idea of what a television schedule looks like, which we all remember, but increasingly is a bit of a forgotten art form when you've got the ability to stream or watch anything on demand and you curate it yourself. And I think that's really exciting for students to see too, because it's not just the forms of media that are out there, it's how we consume them. And I think it gives you a very different idea of consumption when you've got that curated night of, as Aron says, you used to start off with Star Trek and then go into Peter Gunn. I mean, someone, a scheduler, was responsible for actually working out what that night's entertainment looked like for millions of Australians, basically, when we didn't have that choice of channels. So I think that in itself is quite exciting, to be exposed to those forms. And I mean, for all of us, that's something we can all remember quite well and might still indulge in every now and then. But for our students, particularly our school leaver students, that's a completely different form of consumption. So I think that's really exciting in itself, as well as just this wealth of material. I mean, as I've said before, of course, we're all hoping to find those missing episodes and those really important signature pop culture moments. But in and of themselves, to have those voiceovers, to have those station IDs, to have those advertisements is incredibly valuable material, and all moments that are missing from the archives at the moment.
I well remember eagerly going through the TV guide every day, and you go through the different stations and see what's on, and I compare that with what my daughters, how they experience television today, and they said to me they do not watch, maybe with one exception, they do not watch linear television on any of the broadcast networks here in Australia, and they've got that sort of a la carte choice where they can just order off the menu, as it were, in terms of what they want to watch, and it is, as you say, a completely different world today. Maybe better, maybe worse, but it would be a definite eye-opener for your students, given their sort of age demographic.
Yeah, very much so. And of course, that wasn't just an Australian thing. I mean, NBC sort of in America built their audience around those nights of comedy with signature shows like Seinfeld and kind of building out the schedules that way. So I think it's quite interesting to sort of have the students exposed to those different consumption practices as well, and also get a sense of what Australian TV looked like, because we really did have an extremely magpie form of television out here, where we had a bit of American, a bit of British, and then the Australian content as well, all mixed together. I mean, it used to be a comment in the late 90s that Australia was one of the best places to watch TV in the world, because we just had exposure to all of these different TV series, all filtered through a limited number of channels. So we had all those early HBO shows thanks to Channel 9. We had all of our cult sci-fi stuff on. It was late at night, but we had it on TV and represented across the channels. Of course, talked about before, I mean, we were one of the best places in the world to watch Doctor Who, because the ABC just kept happily repeating it. And I think that's something which is really important for Australian TV culture too. It's not just the shows that we actually produce, it's how we presented the world's television shows back to Australians, I think is really interesting too.
Now, Aron, you were talking about the building up of the collection. What else can you say about about William and Noel and Simon?
So William, who was Noel's father, was taping stuff from about when Noel was a 10-year-old. And the earliest stuff, Simon said, as I said, he recorded Star Trek and Doctor Who. That science fiction was his favourite. And then he recorded every episode of Countdown, another top 10 missing show in Australia, from the very first episode all the way through.
Countdown is a music show hosted by Ian Molly Meldrum, for people who don't live in Australia, on the ABC.
It is, and as I mentioned on the last time I did an interview about this, I went to Noel's funeral, and in a couple of the eulogies, they mentioned how much he loved Countdown and how he recorded every episode. And I spoke to people and said, you mean recorded audio or video? Oh, no, he had them all on video. The most tragic thing, and this is a big update since the last podcast, Simon, who I was dealing with, who became a regular sort of in the shop, not because he was interested in collectibles or anything. I think he was just a very lonely person. And because I'd built up a rapport with him, he would come in just to give me updates and say I found some stuff, and I would go back to the estate and he would give me some stuff, and I would spend an afternoon chatting with him. Simon sadly passed away just before Christmas. And again, he wasn't someone who had a huge family. The people who knew him, who he classed of his family, have kind of said Simon would be fine with you now, talking about him more openly and revealing some of the stuff that happened there. And this is where it goes to, you can't make this stuff up. Simon was one of the Pluka ducks on an Australian show called Hey Hey It's Saturday. So sorry for anyone who thought there was one Pluka duck. Apparently there was about 4 of them. Simon wasn't the main one, but he was often on. And while I was going through this estate with him, he just told me crazy stories all the time about stuff he did as Pluka duck. And local celebrities and international celebrities that just didn't know how to take the show. I mean, this is a bit of a sideways for a Doctor Who podcast, but anyone who doesn't know Pluka Duck, look up YouTube Pluka Duck's best moments and you will be just horrified by what went on Australian television in the 80s. But the thing that is just crazy to me, there are missing episodes of Hey Hey It's Saturday, and they are actively trying to recover the missing early episodes of Hey Hey It's Saturday. Simon worked on Hey Hey It's Saturday, and he was the one who basically said no one wants this stuff and junked all the earliest recordings first. Now, I don't know if there was Hey Hey It's Saturday there, but he would have known that Countdown didn't exist. And he said to me, I threw out all the reel-to-reel and pneumatic stuff first because you can't watch it anymore. No one could watch it. And that just blows me away because they had 8 pneumatic machines under the house and reel-to-reel editing desks and all this amazing stuff that I think most made its way up to Canberra just because I thought that might be the only way to play some of this stuff back. And he literally said stuff to me that made my head just spin, where you found that Star Trek tape, that must have dropped off of the top of the box when we threw all of those out because it was just sitting in a hallway when all the other stuff was kind of meticulously put in boxes. But he had deliberately gone through the older stuff and threw all that out first.
And that's because he didn't understand the true value of what it was.
He had no idea or thought it all existed, maybe. But I do know with Hey Hey It's Saturday, there is like a push to try and find that stuff back. And Countdown, there's definitely, a huge awareness within the music community of how important a lot of that early Countdown first appearance of bands live on television, and then probably even clips from Top of the Pops that might be missing, because I know with some of the stuff that exists from that era, that's where some of the live stuff from international acts comes from. So what was lost there, if he really did have a full run, which I believe he did, was absolutely priceless. And that's where Jason will probably be able to pick up when it gets to the 70s, switched over to early Betamax, if it is a complete record from there on in, if everything is there. Because I don't think any of the Beta stuff was destroyed. I know I found most of the television runs of Doctor Who in order in different boxes. So there was the sort of the earlier runs in the 80s, I remember from my childhood, and then there was the later ones, then when they repeated it all again just before the new series sort of took over. So I do know that he re-recorded redundant material that he already had, which is crazy when you've got a collection as big as you've got.
So effectively, every time Doctor Who was repeated on the ABC, he would repeat that run. So there's multiple runs of multiple particular eras.
Absolutely. So if you remember a particular continuity that hasn't turned up on YouTube, chances are Jason will find it at some point.
And just to clarify, just so that people get these personalities straight in their head, William Williams is the father who started this off recording for Noel, his son. Noel then continued that on after his father William passed away. And at some point, Simon started living in the same house as Noel. And then Noel has sadly passed away himself. And yes. Simon, not knowing what is actually there, has turfed a lot of the very early stuff. And then unfortunately, Simon himself has passed away, as you said, just before Christmas last year.
Yes, so the whole estate is a very sort of tragic story. Simon was very easy to deal with for me, but he also had mental issues. I'm not saying anything I didn't ask the family if I could talk about, and they said, yeah, that was fine. He probably was bipolar. And on some days, he was the nicest guy, and he'd sit and chat to me all day and tell me all these stories about Australian television history. And, I'd sit there and go, this can't be true. And then I'd be, well, no one could make this stuff up, so it must be true. And then other days, he would be howling at the moon crazy, where I was just hoping he would not attack me, because it did seem that he would be punching, pillows and just screaming and swearing at the ceiling kind of thing. But he never really interfered with me or anything while I was going through stuff. But it made it a very tense situation going through this huge estate for months and months and months, and discovering more and more things. You really didn't know what Simon you were going to get on the day that you came in to look at stuff.
And Jason, that sort of personal history, that I suppose forms part of any sort of collection that you'd be working through. I mean, in a sense, the collection that you've received is a reflection of Noel's personality, his sort of magpie need to collect everything personality.
Yeah, and I think that's always true of these collections, that in some way they always reflect the personality of the collector. And I think, it's interesting. We've talked a lot around ideas of value and estate planning and these kind of things. And I think that's one of the dangers when we talk about collections and collectibles and what's hoarding and what's collecting, all these sorts of things, is that we talk a lot about economic value, but of course it's the cultural value of these collections which is key. The way that someone's devoted passion and interest can translate into a recording material that would otherwise be lost. And I think that's something we kind of need to turn the dial on a bit, that value isn't just something measured in economic terms. It's very much that cultural value and that idea of the collector or hoarder as curator in some way, that obviously it's an uncurated collection, but because there is that passionate need to kind of record and have these things, that means there is an act of saving them from that kind of oblivion otherwise that so much ephemeral material goes into. So yes, I think you're absolutely right that collections reflect the personality of the collector, and the more you know about the collector, I think the more fascinating the collection. Certainly it's wonderful, Aron, to hear that that family history and those connections, because I think that helps inform us as researchers as we're working through the material and brings it alive in that way.
And Aron, I suppose in a sense, whilst it's sad that a certain amount of this material is gone, in a sense, if it wasn't for Simon, you would never have come across this collection at all.
No, Simon was a friend of very close friends to me, and I did know him as in maybe I'd see him at Christmas and things like that. I can't remember if it was my family or Simon remembered that I was a Doctor Who fan, and when they were throwing everything out and everything had to go, the family called me and said, look, Simon has to get rid of everything. You need to go over and pick out whatever you want. And he had thought very, very nicely, what I would want would be the Eagle Moss Doctor Who figurines and the more modern merchandise and things like that. And I didn't even realise because he said, here's the Doctor Who stuff. And I think all Doctor Who fans, get this. When a well-meaning relative knows you're a Doctor Who fan, they go, oh, look, I've got an amazing book for you. And it's the Jodie Whittaker annual that was on special at Kmart or something. So I was truly expecting to go out and get like a handful of DVDs, maybe some toys and books if you're lucky, and maybe you might get something rare. And so when I went out, he said, well, look, there's the Doctor Who stuff. And it was a full run of the Eagle Moss little statuettes that came with the magazines. And then there was almost a full run of all the Doctor Who comics, and then there was a whole lot of, graphic novels and things like that. And the more I was looking at it, I was going, oh, this is actually quite a collection. And, I said to Simon, well, what do you want? He's like, it's all going in the hard waste. You can just take what you want. It's actually going to help me if you clear stuff out. And that was sort of in a shed outside, because there were many sheds full of stuff, like everything you could imagine. And that first time, I filled an entire car, and he said, come back. And then that first day I went into the house for the first time and realized I was walking through, we weren't looking at just a regular collection. It was a massive hoarders collection. And the more I went through it, it was like going down a rabbit hole. There were rooms of different things, and it ranged from junk. And I can understand from Simon's point of view, Noel was the hoarder that really collected anything. So you could open a box and it would be full of audio tapes, or you could open a box and it would be full of junk food wrappers from the 80s, because he really just did hoard and collect everything. And when it got to the point that the house was, I guess, a medical risk for people to come in, I can understand you are not going to spend weeks and weeks and weeks sorting through this stuff. You're probably just going to go, okay, we need to clear it out. So it went from being a Doctor Who collection I'm going to pick up from a friend to a much bigger deal, and then the time pressure to get everything out. One of the things we haven't talked about, Noel was maybe not a hoarder, but he was a collector himself. Noel was 10, in about 1969, 1970. William was recording stuff before that, and he was recording stuff on audio, reel-to-reel audios. And there are boxes and boxes of off-air recordings that have gone up to the university, and I found boxes and boxes more. And one of the things I didn't know in Australia, often the American plays or the British plays would be recorded and played here, but often they wouldn't. They'd send the script over and then they would record local versions of Superman and things like that. And basically none of that exists. It's very, very hard to find any of that early Australian radio media. And there's a potential for there to be huge amounts of that in this collection because he was recording a lot of that kind of stuff. And it looks like the earliest stuff he was collecting and hoarding went right back to the 40s.
Not necessarily audio-visual material, do you think? I mean, was there the capacity to even record stuff back in the 40s and 50s?
Noel was in one of the universities here, and he was in the electronics department, and that's why he had... The earliest stuff I found were like ham radio magazines from about 1940, 1941, and then he had the full runs of those magazines all the way through, and a lot of electronic magazines. He was really interested in that, and obviously Noel sort of got into that as well, and he continued with the electronics and computers and recording. So he definitely inherited his father's interest in recording media, collecting stuff, and ultimately it turned into an obsession and hoarding a house full of stuff. So from many different levels, there's a lot of stuff to still be discovered from this collection.
Countdown for blast-off has begun, and another journey into space aboard the Starship Enterprise is about to begin in Star Trek, next on 9. Stay tuned for it, and for your Peter Gunn premiere movie at 8:30.
New Faces 76 has been a presentation of the National 9 Network from Television City, Melbourne.
There are 639 muscles in the human body. Now there's a new way to exercise every one of them. In your neck, your arms, your shoulders, your waist, your midriff, your everything. This week in the Australian Women's Weekly, Dr. Neil Solomon's master plan for a more beautiful you is revealed. Then, to lose weight as well, a personal testimonial for an Israeli army diet. A diet to keep you comfortable, not hungry, and you could lose up to a stone in 8 days. Prince Charles is 28 this month. The Weekly's astrologer has prepared a special horoscope. Will Charles be the last reigning monarch of England, as his horoscope suggests? There's an Australia-wide search for a new female film star. Read what she'll be like. Read the true story of Australian girl Kim Rann and her romance with Fonzie. Read about Gloria Swanson's organic husband. The Weekly helps you prepare for the festive season with 5 pages of Christmas cooking and instructions to crochet an exquisite nativity scene. It's all in this week's Australian Women's Weekly with Prince Charles on the cover, and it's out now.
Now, just to jump back to that stuff that you sent to the UK, what else can you talk about in terms of what you've seen that was on there other than ads? I mean, is there other missing material that relates to television shows themselves, or not?
No, I can say the people who were looking through it were excited because there was an episode of Softly Softly, and I think out of the 2 first seasons of Softly Softly, there's like 105 episodes and maybe 4 of them exist. And this was really unlucky. It was an existing episode of Series 3. So another one of those. Oh no. But apparently that wasn't a full episode. Whatever he had recorded, he'd left recording and that was on the end of it. But that would have been quite a major recovery, even if it was a partial episode of something lost, which is sort of revered by a lot of people of the era who grew up with that. I would be surprised the amount of material that was saved if there isn't at least one big, incredible find, be it a Countdown, a British show, or fingers crossed Doctor Who. Last time when I spoke about it, I didn't know what was in any of the tapes, and I really didn't want to get anyone's hopes up leading up to the 60th or anything like that. This time, I'm pretty sure there was missing Doctor Who recorded. It's just a case of let's just fingers crossed it fell out of the tub of what was going to the skip that day and is in the collection with Canberra or Jason. I mentioned to Jason before we started the recording, I don't even know how much 60s stuff went up there because I was just looking in a box. It's full of audio visual material, get it in to go up into the truck. Jason, can you give us a better idea of how much 60s stuff or 70s stuff there might be that we're potentially having a better chance of finding something really interesting?
As I said earlier, I mean, the problem is we've only catalogued a quarter of the collection in terms of actually what type of tapes they are. We haven't really gone through what's on the tapes. So no, is the short answer, I'm sorry to say, because we've basically, again, done it basically, as you know, Aaron. I mean, it was just a lot of tubs of material. And we've basically just started with the tub that was closest and kind of worked our way through and moved it from one room to the other. So no, I wouldn't like to speculate yet until we've at least gone through about half of the collection to know exactly the volume of stuff that was there.
I do know there is some 60s stuff because I
Yes,
know
there
when it was piled up in the tubs, I could see it through the tubs. I just couldn't see what was on it, and there was no way I was going to start like unloading a pyramid of stuff to get to the bottom to find what was on there. It was just too hard to move the stuff around. If there is 60s stuff reel to reel, you're quite happy to work with the UK and have that transferred over there and digitalized, and so anyone who's worried about it not being looked after by the correct people, or I'm sure we have a lot of people in Australia that can do it, but it'll go to the best people to look at this material.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I don't doubt there's probably quite a few listeners who are wondering, why don't they just pull their finger out and get on with it and all these sorts of things. But I mean, one of the reasons why it takes time is the scale of the collection. As you say, it was packed in a certain way that it is a bit of a game of Tetris. You have to be careful how you unpack it, that you're not creating any further damage to any of the tapes and other devices and recording devices particularly. Also, it is making sure that the best people are working through the material, because in some instances it will only be playable once, as you say. So that's why we do have those partners in the UK that are going to work with us on this, because they're best placed to handle this very fragile material, make sure they extract the best from it if we only have one shot at it. And it's also why I sort of opened by saying that we'll start with some of the VHS and beta, because that obviously is a lot easier for us to manage, without risking the fragility of some of this equipment. So it's the scale and the fragility and volume, I suppose, in terms of just how you manage working through this work that is why we're doing it so slowly, because we want to do it thoroughly. I think we all feel that loss of whatever was thrown out ahead of time. We don't want anything to be damaged that we currently have got in this collection. So that's why it is quite a methodical, thorough process. And you're absolutely right, Aaron. That's why we've got those partners in the UK to work with us on the most fragile materials.
And the other thing, which I forgot to say comes up quite a bit in the discussions about this collection, I will not keep anything secret. If we get like a big hit, even if it's like Space Pirates or something, I'm not the type of person who's going to go, oh, well, let's wait till the 65th anniversary of the show. If it was confirmed, I'd want to get that information out there straight away, because being a Doctor Who fan myself, one of the most exciting pieces of news for me is if there's a missing episode recovery. And I wouldn't want to be the one who held that back from the public. So over the time that we've been looking through this collection, I have had people call the shop and come into the shop, and I have been as open about that and as transparent as I can. There is no hidden material or the agenda of squirreling stuff away for a big announcement or anything like that. If there is something found, I would definitely announce it straight away.
And I'd absolutely echo that, Aaron. I mean, that certainly is the university's intention as well, and the researchers that work on this. And I mean, part of setting up that platform for public consumption is around sharing the material as we find it. I mean, I love, the reactions that I've had personally and the university's had as well to being on the podcast and people reaching out and wanting to volunteer and be part of it, et cetera, even putting through their wish list of various series that they'd like us to find. I think that part of it is it's the scale of the collection, and I keep referring to that just to give you an idea of the enormity of it. The scale of the collection means this will be a journey that we're going on together, and I think part of that journey is keeping the public informed of what we find. It'll be everything from those interesting, nuggets of ads and interstitials and bumpers and things that will be there on the tapes, through to what we hope will be some big discoveries along the way as well. So certainly I'd echo everything Aaron said. This will be a very transparent process. I see it as a journey. It certainly will take a number of people over a number of years to be working through this. So it's an exciting journey to be on, but we're all on it together. And I'd say that very much so, that we will be sharing all of our discoveries along the way.
And also, I think the 60s and 70s stuff will, of course, be prioritised. It's not going to be like, well, we're going to save the best stuff for last. Everybody wants to know what's on the earlier stuff, including me. Last time we talked about this, I did not know what was it. Now I have a tiny window of some of the stuff that's there. So, Mark, Rob, if you get a call, strap on the headphones. We've got to do a show.
Emergency podcast.
You might be breaking some very interesting news. Yeah.
Peter Gunn goes looking for action and finds more than he'd bargained for. It's a premiere action movie next on 9, followed by Face the Nation.
It's been a long day of driving in this 18-wheeler and I need a McDonald's drink. I asked the lady at the counter, can I have a quarter pounder? She gives a pretty head of shake. McDonald's quarter pounder really takes a lot of beef. Ain't nothing else that tastes so neat. McDonald's quarter pounder really takes a lot of meat. It's a full quarter pound of beef.
Jason, in terms of the outputs of the catalogue, when you've gone through all the tapes and everything like that, would the National Archive also be interested in what the outputs are and maybe absorbing some of that into their own collection, capturing some of the Australian heritage, do you think?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, the National Film and Sound Archive, like all other collections and archives, has a number of priority areas that they're working towards. Certainly, they are Australia's premier site for preserving our media traditions and our cultural history when it comes to audiovisual material. And absolutely, there've been some communications with them early on, and certainly that's part of that sharing process. So it's the old thing that when you look at the volume of this material and think about the volume of material that's out there, the volume of material that the National Film and Sound Archive has, it's basically people working together to get this done. So it's not really it's not a competition between different institutions. It's very much a partnership because we're all as interested as your listeners are, as the fans are, in finding new material that has otherwise been thought lost. So certainly the National Film and Sound Archive has expressed an interest in, potentially what we find in terms of material there to share. So yes, that's a good part of that partnership.
Here's Mr. Squiggle, with lots of fun for everyone. Here's Mr. Squiggle, sing a happy tune. You can see we're as happy as can be. Mr. Squiggle, the man from...
There was news in the last 24 hours that the Mr. Squiggle collection, a large portion of it, had been donated to the National Museum. And it sort of got us talking about the parlous, lamentable state of lack of knowledge about what actually exists in Australia's commercial and even non-commercial networks in terms of their archive holdings.
One of the sad things that I've discovered over this process is just lack of information there is as to what actually exists of the Australian TV cultural heritage, be it local shows or news and different things like that. The Mr. Squiggle announcement, it was interesting. And I really hope you open this episode with the Here's Mr. Squiggle theme, just to confuse everyone.
Even more than what they currently are.
Yeah. Mr. Squiggle, for anyone who's listening from overseas, was a kids show that ran for about 40 years from the late 50s up until the 90s and is beloved by a lot of people. It's a quirky kids show that's sort of eccentric enough to be sort of a bit of a cult following as well. So they've just announced, as you said, that the creator of the show had quite an archive of material, props and squiggles from the show, and it's been donated to a museum. And I can't even work out what exists and what doesn't exist for Mr. Squiggle. And if you get on YouTube, there's 2 clips that purport to be the earliest existing clips of Mr. Squiggle. And I don't know if either of them are. And trying to look it up, the best sites were English sites that are quite good at cataloguing missing material. And even Mr. Squiggle just said partially missing with no list of what was there and what wasn't. And I think that really speaks to the need of someone or some organisation in Australia or a webmaster to do some research and actually start cataloguing what's missing and what exists here. And I think the popular stuff, maybe the sci-fi stuff that there's a lot of interest in, or Countdown because it's music. Yes, there are sites dedicated to that. Yes, there's sites dedicated to Hey, It's Saturday. I found a box in this collection that seemed like a years and years run of an Australian show called Eat Carpet, which was an avant-garde sort of evening on SBS, which did student films, international films. It was punctuated by comedy clips with local Australian comedians. And I thought, well, this is interesting because I've looked for this on YouTube and there seems to be like 2 existing episodes off VHS. So I actually contacted SBS and said, look, I found all of this. And they said, well, we don't know if it exists or not. Why are you calling us? And I'm, well, you were the ones that broadcast it. And then I got a very confused secretary ring me back a couple of weeks later and go, well, it was a show where students just sent in student films and we played them, and you'd have to track down the students and see if they've still got the films to see if they exist. That isn't how the Australian archive should be. There should be some list somewhere that actually says what exists. And I mean, SBS is not one of the big networks here, but it just does go to show that, again, a cult show that was very popular when I was growing up in high school, they don't even have a clue of what exists for it. And I might have a box of a whole heap of missing material. This was found after the stuff that went up to Canberra. There needs to be an Australian kaleidoscope or something like that actually people can look at when they find this material, rather than ringing me or something. I'm happy to be involved, actually. I'm happy to collect the material, but there is just too much interest and too much volume of material for me to deal with. And the other thing, for anyone overseas saying, well, why should we care? You've got to remember the ABC was like a repository of the BBC's output. And a lot of stuff that was wiped by the BBC got repeated on the ABC and other Australian networks for years and years and years after it was out of the BBC archive. So it would be a help if there was something local or someone local or a group local that looked into this kind of thing.
The Radio Times and the BBC are very good about having their treasure hunt campaigns every year, every 2 years. They're always finding stuff all the time. We're here, there's nothing like that, is there, really?
The only thing you ever really see is a clip from John Farnham was found in the basement at an ABC warehouse, and it's massive news. So I do think there is the interest in Australia for a show like that to be quite popular. If you could have a show that showed old adverts that are a bit out of the time now, clips from shows that had been recovered or people remembered but you can't see them anywhere else, I think there would be a following. I don't know if it would be a following on free to air anymore. It might have to be a YouTube program or something like that. But just from the reaction talking about missing material in Australia from the last time we had a talk, beyond Doctor Who, there is a huge amount of interest in this kind of material because everyone grew up having a favourite show. Everyone grew up watching something that they can't find anymore. For every one of us that watched Doctor Who, someone was tuning into Sweet and Sour or Home before it was on and turned off when Doctor Who came on. And we're quite lucky. We can get most of Doctor Who that still exists. Try and find any of those other shows.
Which, to wrap things up, is why what Jason has taken on, it's such a critically important endeavour and a really welcome one. And it may be, I suppose, Aron and Jason, the first stepping stones in the creation of something more substantial in terms of, preserving Australia's television cultural heritage on a more professional and accessible basis.
Yeah, I think particularly I'd talk about access, Rob. I think that's part of the frustration. I mean, we know that the National Film and Sound Archive has a great volume of material, but even they will admit it's often hard to access a lot of that or put it out there in ways that the public can consume. And I think if this project can help build awareness in the first place, so we do have people recognising that cultural value, as you say, doing some estate planning, reaching out to people saying, is this of interest, is this of value, I think that's a great first step. But I'd love to see something like the Australian equivalent of Kaleidoscope. I'd love to see that kind of recognition of the importance of our television history and actually embracing that idea that we've got this wonderful patchwork television history of local production and received shows from America and the UK and thanks to SBS all over the world. And that's part of our television history here in Australia. And when we don't celebrate that enough, and I think that having a repository where we can enjoy that content again, even if it's in, short snippets or pieces or even just, title sequences and theme music, which brings back so many memories for people, I think would be really exciting to see that sort of grow out of this. So I think you're right. It's the first step.
Just before we go, Aron, obviously, if there is anyone out there listening who has themselves a large collection of material or knows someone who has a large collection that they need to know what perhaps to do with it, you're happy to be a conduit, is that right?
Absolutely. You know, my details are very easy to find online because I have a shop. It's Aron's Collectables in Blackburn in Victoria. You can come in for a chat. I'm quite open about chatting about all this stuff, and you can buy something when you come into the shop and help me out as well. But the one thing I would probably leave with from dealing with deceased estates, as I've said, since this collection, I've seen 2 more massive deceased estates with rotting VHS boxes and boxes and boxes. If you do have a relative or you have someone who has a collection like this or has been hoarding stuff their whole life, it's much easier to deal with it while that person is still alive and can sort of see that their legacy is enjoyed and appreciated by other people, rather than letting it rot in the garage for a decade and then get thrown out. It's easier to go through a collection while it's still in good condition and inside, rather than something that's been shoved in the garage and has started to deteriorate. So if you do know a relative or someone, maybe help out by just cataloguing what they've got. And if they've got something really unusual, like pre-80s, 70s formats, definitely get in contact and say, hey, I've got an uncle who did have a pneumatic machine and was recording Countdown in the 70s or something like that, because they will become a hero to people. If you find a missing episode of Countdown or anything else, there will be a section of society who will love to see that. And your relative or you, if you've got it, will have a little epoch in Australian history or maybe global history, because I certainly remember the names of every single person who've recovered Doctor Who episodes for the last 30 years.
Any hoarders out there, please start your Swedish death cleaning right now, so we can make it easier for obviously your family members.
Exactly. And as we've discussed earlier, we're completely open and honest, and there's no games or trickery going on behind the scenes. If something is returned that is missing, as soon as we're able to, Jason's able to, you, Aron, are able to, we'll make the announcement. Nothing goes into a black hole. We're all as open and as honest as possible.
Yeah, I think, as I started off by saying, there was a bit of discussion on the Ian Levine website about how, this has all sort of disappeared. I'm quite open to talk about it. It just, there really hasn't been much going on. I did get the material back. There wasn't anything amazing. It confirmed some of the stuff that I was told, which is great. There's no secrecy behind it. Nothing's being hid or anything like that. It's just, there really has not been much news until, Jason's able to say that he's starting looking through the collection, and obviously there'll be more and more information as the collection is actually assessed.
And we'll certainly, as Jason is able to tell us, bring further updates to our loyal listeners.
Good luck, Jason, with everything.
Thank you.
Now, Rob, one other question people have been asking us, apart from what's going on with these tapes, but maybe less important, is, are we coming back, Rob?
Well, clearly we are, Mark, because we're here in their
Exactly,
ear holes.
we are back, yes. Hopefully back on your feet a little bit more regularly than what we have been for the last maybe 6 to 8 months, so yes.
Can I come on and talk about Doctor Who toys and merchandise and not have to worry about missing episodes?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you once again to Aron and Jason for coming on. I've been Rob.
I've been Mark.
I've been Aron.
And I've been Jason.
And we'll speak again soon.
You've just listened to another episode of 42 to Doomsday, the podcast that loves talking about Doctor Who. We'd love to hear from our listeners. Please drop us a line at 42todoomsday@gmail.com. We can be reached at facebook.com/42 to Doomsday. If brevity is your game, we can be found on Twitter at 42 to Doomsday. Please check out our blog, 42todoomsday.wordpress.com, where Mark and I occasionally have something interesting to say. Aside from iTunes, you can listen to us via Stitcher and Player FM. If you enjoyed listening to us, leave a review on iTunes. As always, thank you for listening. Have a great week. We'll speak with you again soon.
Is there anything you think we've missed?
Other than announcing we found Power of the Daleks tonight, no, I don't think we can.
Going to debut, you have to go to the National Archives in Camp to see it. Can you imagine that?